Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. General Shiro Ishii commanded the sinister Unit 731, built in Manchuria in the 1930s under the disguise of the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Institute. Its buildings hid biological warfare laboratories where men, women, and children were used as test subjects. Ishii dreamed of creating invisible weapons capable of changing the course of the war. While celebrated in Japan as a brilliant scientist, he was in reality turning science into a meticulously planned field of horrors. Most of the victims were captured Chinese, but Soviets, Koreans, and even deceived civilians were also taken there. Scientists cultivated bacteria such as bubonic plague, anthrax, and cholera on an industrial scale, enough to wipe out the world's population many times over. Part of this arsenal was tested in villages, spreading diseases that devastated entire communities. Unit 731 became the largest biological warfare center of the 20th century, with an impact beyond Asia's borders. In the 1960s, Margaret Lovatt joined an experiment at the Dolphin House in St. Thomas, living for weeks in a flooded space with the dolphin Peter. The goal was to teach him to speak English, recording sounds and communication patterns with NASA support, which saw it as a model for contact with extraterrestrial beings. Daily coexistence brought the two unexpectedly close. Peter developed behaviors interpreted as signs of passion for the researcher. With the increasingly intense bond, Peter began to get distracted during language lessons with sexual demonstrations. To avoid interrupting the studies, Margaret used unusual methods, such as manually relieving his frustrations, allowing him to refocus on the exercises. The revelation caused controversy years later, raising debates about ethical limits in science. After the project ended and he was transferred to another center, Peter declined without her presence and died soon after. Sidney Gottlieb, a CIA chemist, supervised Project MK-Ultra beginning in the early 1950s. Created to study mind control techniques, the program used hallucinogenic drugs, electric shocks, and sensory deprivation methods. It also operated under the names MK Naomi and MK Delta, indicating secret subprojects. The codename Ultra was a direct reference to top-secret military documents from World War II. Among the experiments, volunteers and people without consent were subjected to tests with invasive devices attached to their heads. The goal was to map brain stimuli and understand how to alter human behavior. Many suffered seizures, severe pain, and psychological damage. Such tests occurred in both military facilities and psychiatric hospitals, expanding the program's reach and increasing the number of victims exposed to CIA practices. One of the most controversial subprojects was Operation Midnight Climax, carried out in cities such as San Francisco and New York. Prostitutes hired by the CIA lured men into secret safe houses where they were given LSD and drinks and observed through one-way mirrors. These tests, conducted between 1953 and 1965, focused on sexual blackmail, surveillance, and the use of drugs to manipulate memories and induce behaviors. After press reports in the 1970s, official documents revealed the extent of MK-Ultra. Records showed CIA infiltration in social groups and the distribution of LSD to civilians without warning. Congressional investigations concluded that the agency violated laws and exposed citizens to serious risks. The case became one of the biggest scandals in the history of American intelligence, symbolizing the limits crossed in the name of the Cold War. The United States Navy released bacteria over San Francisco in a secret Cold War test. The project, called Operation Sea Spray, aimed to measure the vulnerability of large cities to a biological attack. Using military ships in the bay, scientists spread microorganisms into the urban atmosphere, believing they were harmless. The goal was to assess how winds would carry the material and how far the population would be affected without noticing. The bacterial fog spread silently over the city, entering streets, houses, and hospitals. The samples included Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii, capable of causing respiratory and urinary infections. Shortly afterward, doctors recorded unusual disease outbreaks, and the death of a patient was linked to the experiment. For decades, the episode was concealed, and only in the 1970s did it emerge that San Francisco had served as the Navy's human laboratory. In 1965, identical twins Bruce and Brian Reimer were born in Winnipeg, Canada. At 7 months, Bruce suffered an accident during a circumcision that destroyed his genital organ. With no alternatives, the parents sought psychologist John Money, who argued that gender was learned. He saw the case as a chance to prove his theory and suggested that Bruce be raised as a girl, starting one of the most controversial experiments in medicine. Renamed Brenda, Bruce was raised as a girl, while Brian grew up normally as a boy. John Money promoted the case as a scientific success, but in reality, Brenda rejected clothes, toys, and imposed behaviors. The psychologist even forced humiliating sessions on the twins to reinforce gender roles. These traumatic experiences marked the brothers' childhood and increased their suffering. As a teenager, Brenda could no longer endure the imposed identity. At 14, she revealed she had never felt like a girl and decided to return to her male condition, changing her name to David. He underwent reconstructive surgeries, began hormone treatment, and changed his legal documents. The case, once celebrated by John Money, turned into an ethical and medical failure, becoming internationally known as an example of abuse in the name of science. In adulthood, David tried to rebuild his life, got married, and tried to move on, but carried deep scars. He suffered from depression and eventually died in 2004. The case became famous for exposing the risks of John Money's theory, which argued that gender was shaped only by upbringing and not by biology. This view influenced studies for decades, but after the failure was revealed, it became an example of how scientific ideologies can destroy lives. The Little Albert experiment, conducted in 1920 by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner at Johns Hopkins University, sought to prove that fear could be learned. A 9-month-old baby was exposed to animals such as rabbits and rats, initially without reaction. Soon, the researchers began associating these stimuli with loud, frightening noises. In a short time, Albert developed phobias, not only of animals, but also of objects with similar textures, such as cotton and even a Santa Claus mask. The study aimed to demonstrate that human emotions could be conditioned, but it left the child with intense and generalized fears. Albert cried in front of dogs, furs, and even toys, without ever receiving treatment to reverse the trauma. The case was abandoned without scientific ethics and without proper consent. Decades later, scholars suggested that Albert may have been Douglas Merritt, a child with neurological problems who died young, further increasing the controversy of the experiment. Dr. Saul Krugman of New York University led experiments at Willowbrook State School during the 1950s when hepatitis outbreaks were common among children with mental disabilities. To test vaccines, he deliberately infected inmates, using even milk and food contaminated with the virus. Parents seeking vacancies in the overcrowded institution agreed to sign permissions. The study lasted nearly 20 years and involved hundreds of children, becoming one of the most controversial in medical history. The United States Navy exposed young sailors to mustard gas in 1943, claiming to be testing protective clothing and masks. 17 and 18-year-old boys were taken to the Naval Laboratory in Washington and only then informed that they would face the deadly gas. Many suffered internal and external burns but were forced to continue. To silence reports, some were threatened under the Espionage Act, keeping the experiment secret for decades. The effects of mustard gas were devastating. Painful wounds, extensive blisters, and permanent scars marked hundreds of soldiers. Many carried physical and psychological damage for life without any government support. Although penicillin already existed, the Navy did not provide proper treatments. Only in 1991, after documents were declassified, were reports presented to Congress, revealing the severity of the exposures. Rollins Edwards, a soldier exposed in 1945, spent more than 70 years with skin peeling off in flakes due to chemical burns. To prove what he had suffered, he even carried a jar with pieces of his own skin. He became a living symbol of the fight for recognition of the victims of these tests. His story highlighted military negligence and the reality of how secret experiments left eternal scars on young men who believed they were serving their country. Dr. Aubrey Levin, a colonel in the South African Army, led a program to cure homosexuality during apartheid. At Voortrekkerhoogte Military Hospital in Pretoria, more than 900 young men were subjected to electroshocks and even forced sex change surgeries without consent. Levin believed aversion therapy could reorient soldiers, receiving government support and being nicknamed Dr. Shock by his own patients. In the experiments, electrodes were attached to the bodies of the inmates and electric shocks were applied whenever arousal appeared in response to male images. In addition to shocks, many were subjected to chemical castration and hormone treatments. After the regime ended, Levine was accused of crimes against human rights, but managed to emigrate to Canada. There, he worked as a psychiatrist for decades until he was once again investigated for abuses against patients. In the 1940s, Guatemalan citizens were used as test subjects in a secret experiment conducted by the United States with support from the government of Juan José Arevalo. Soldiers, prisoners, and psychiatric hospital patients were subjected to procedures without any explanation. Many believed they were receiving normal medical care, but they were being involved in a study aimed at observing venereal infections in humans. The experiments included the deliberate infection of men and women with syphilis, gonorrhea, and other sexually transmitted diseases. Prostitutes were used to facilitate contamination, and doctors delayed treatments to study the natural progression of the illnesses. Despite the later use of antibiotics, there were severe consequences and at least 30 confirmed deaths. Decades later, in 2010, the United States issued a formal apology to Guatemala. The Soviet Union maintained for decades secret poison laboratories known as Laboratory 1, Laboratory 12, and Camera, under the command of security agencies. Since 1921, Gulag prisoners were used as test subjects in fatal substance experiments. The goal was to create tasteless and odorless compounds impossible to detect in autopsies. Among the poisons studied were mustard gas, ricin, digitoxin, cyanide, and curare. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo began the famous Stanford prison experiment, planned to last 2 weeks. University students were randomly divided into guards and prisoners in a simulated prison in the campus basement. Quickly, the guards began adopting cruel behaviors, humiliating and punishing the prisoners. The power of the environment proved so intense that in just 6 days, the experiment had to be stopped. What began as a simple psychological study of social roles revealed how easily ordinary people can become agents of oppression. Some guards created degrading punishments, such as forcing prisoners to wear bags on their heads or perform exhausting exercises. Even knowing it was a simulation, prisoners reported feeling truly incarcerated. The experiment became one of the greatest examples of how authority can corrupt human beings. In the 1940s in Sweden, Vipholm Hospital conducted unethical experiments on patients with mental disabilities to study the relationship between sugar and cavities. The inmates were forced to consume daily huge amounts of extremely sticky candy that clung to their teeth and could not be removed. Funded by the sugar industry, the experiment confirmed that constant sugar consumption causes severe cavities, but at the cost of the patient's health and dignity, who could not refuse. The results of the Vipholm experiment became the definitive proof of the link between sugar and cavities, but the human cost was devastating. Hundreds of patients lost teeth, suffered chronic pain, infections, and never received proper treatment. Although the findings supported dental health policies in Sweden and other countries, the study is remembered as one of the cruelest in medical history, where scientific progress was achieved through the suffering of vulnerable people. Harry Harlow sought to prove that emotional bonding was essential in development, and for that he conducted cruel experiments with rhesus monkeys. In the pit of despair, infants were isolated in vertical polished steel chambers that prevented any contact or external stimulus. After weeks or months, the animals showed clear signs of depression, crouching in corners, rocking repeatedly, and refusing food or interaction. Some never recovered, showing the devastating impact of social deprivation. Harlow believed that only by recreating human suffering in primates could the nature of mental illness be understood. Known as the Monster Study, the experiment was conducted in 1939 at the University of Iowa, led by Wendell Johnson and his student Mary Tudor. To test theories about stuttering, 22 orphan children were divided into two groups. Some received positive encouragement in their speeches, while others were harshly reprimanded for mistakes they did not even make. The result was devastating. Many developed severe speech problems, anxiety, and lasting traumas. The study was kept secret for decades due to its cruelty, as it turned healthy children into carriers of emotional and speech disorders. Nicknamed the Monster Study by Johnson's own colleagues, the experiment became an example of ethical failure in science. Only in 2001 did the state of Iowa issue a public apology to the victims, but for many, the psychological damage remained irreversible, making this episode one of the darkest in psychology's history. In Macon County, Alabama, the United States Public Health Service began a study with the Tuskegee Institute in 1932 to observe the progression of untreated syphilis. 600 poor, illiterate African American sharecroppers were recruited with promises of medical care. Only 399 actually had the disease, but none were told their true diagnosis. The participants believed they were receiving treatment, unaware that they were part of a secret experiment. The men received meals, basic assistance, and funeral insurance as incentives, but not the cure. Even after penicillin was discovered as an effective treatment in 1947, the study continued until 1972. Victims included infected wives and children born with congenital syphilis. The case became a symbol of institutional racism and medical abuse. In 1997, Bill Clinton issued a formal apology, calling it the most infamous biomedical experiment in the United States. Fear is a primary emotion that takes over the body in seconds. Wide eyes, heavy breathing, cold sweat, and tense muscles. These automatic reactions seem universal, but do all humans show emotions with the same facial expressions? This question led psychologist Carney Landis of the University of Minnesota in the early 1920s to create one of the most controversial experiments in psychology. He photographed volunteers while they were exposed to extreme stimuli, smelling ammonia, hearing disturbing noises, and even watching shocking scenes. The climax came when he asked them to decapitate a live rat, believing this would reveal pure expressions of fear and disgust. Many refused, but Landis killed the animal in front of them, capturing their faces in shock. The study failed to prove the existence of universal expressions, but was marked by cruelty and lack of ethics, remembered today as one of psychology's darkest experiments. In the 1960s, Dr. Loretta Bender of Creedmoor Hospital in New York applied electroshocks to children with social difficulties. Her method consisted of interviews, followed by electroconvulsive therapy sessions, performed even on children under 3 years old. Considered a pioneer by some, Bender conducted more than 100 procedures. Many children suffered strong reactions, including seizures and psychological after-effects. The treatments were carried out in a hospital environment where nurses helped restrain patients during the electrical discharges. The sessions caused loss of consciousness, muscle spasms, and disorientation. Although the practice was seen at the time as promising against childhood schizophrenia, results showed limited and painful effects. The use of electroshock on children was later abandoned due to criticism and the risks involved. In the Dachau camps, prisoners were used as test subjects in Nazi survival experiments at high altitudes. In low-pressure chambers simulating altitudes up to 50,000 feet, many suffered convulsions, internal hemorrhages, and loss of consciousness before dying. Under SS orders, Zygmunt Raskier and Ernst Holzlohner also conducted cold water immersions, measuring how long the human body could withstand extreme cold. The goal was to test clothing and equipment for Luftwaffe pilots. Nazis also subjected prisoners to simulated high-altitude ejections tied to parachute systems inside experimental chambers. Many suffered hypoxia, fractures, and irreversible brain damage. Sigmund Rascher coldly recorded every detail, turning agony into numbers for Nazi science. Hundreds are estimated to have died, and their bodies were dissected after the tests. Decades later, some of this data is still referenced in aviation, although it carries a legacy of horror. Under the Nazi regime, Dachau prisoners were used in experiments to test ways of making seawater drinkable. Deprived of food, they received only liquids, salt water, desalinated water, or water mixed with chemicals. The goal was to simulate the survival of castaways, but the effects were cruel. Without anesthesia, they suffered severe dehydration, convulsions, and organ failure, while their agony was coldly recorded. Researchers at Vanderbilt University in the United States conducted a secret experiment in the 1940s involving 829 pregnant women. They received drinks presented as vitamins but containing radioactive iron. The goal was to measure how fast the element crossed the placenta without informing them of the risks. Many mothers suffered hair loss, anemia, rashes, and cancer, while several babies were born with malformations, and at least 7 died of leukemia. Psychologist Stanley Milgram of Yale University began in 1961 a study to measure how far ordinary people would obey authority, even against their conscience. Inspired by the trial of Nazi Adolf Eichmann, Milgram sought to understand whether Holocaust crimes could be explained by blind obedience. Volunteers believed they were participating in a memory experiment, unaware of the true objective. In the test, an actor and a volunteer were separated into different rooms. The volunteer asked questions and, for each wrong answer, was instructed to apply increasingly strong electric shocks. Although the actor's screams of pain were fake, the participant believed they were real. Even in the face of signs of suffering, most continued when assured there would be no punishment. The study revealed the enormous power of authority over human behavior. In 1951, Dr. Albert Kligman of the University of Pennsylvania began using Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia as a site for medical experiments. The complex, inaugurated in 1896 and known for its radial design, housed thousands of inmates. There, Kligman saw a scientific opportunity and initiated tests that would later be associated with the development of retin-A, but also with serious ethical concerns. For 2 decades, prisoners received applications of creams, deodorants, shampoos, hair dyes, and industrial chemicals. Many suffered severe reactions such as burns, blisters, scars, and intense pain. Reports also describe poisonings and constant inflammations. Some inmates were subjected to as many as 20 tests at the same time. Although official records denied deaths, the physical and psychological damage deeply marked the participants. At the Stateville Penitentiary in Crest Hill, Illinois, United States Army doctors conducted experiments with malaria-carrying mosquitoes. The project, started in 1945, was part of the war effort to seek more effective drugs against the disease. Prisoners were used as volunteers and exposed to direct bites on the skin, allowing scientists to observe the infection's progress and test different treatments. The inmates were kept in a special ward where doctors monitored fevers, chills, vomiting, and other typical symptoms of malaria. Over the weeks, they received various experimental drugs, some effective and others with severe and painful reactions. These studies provided important information used during World War II, but exposed prisoners to serious risks, prolonged suffering, and intense side effects. In 1954, after the Castle Bravo nuclear test in the Marshall Islands, the United States government launched Project 4.1 to study the effects of radiation on humans. The explosion released more radiation than expected, and 239 residents were exposed without consent. Many suffered burns, hair loss, cancer, and deformities. Although authorities claimed it was an accident, part of the population believed the study had been planned before the test. The United States Army conducted secret biological warfare tests between 1956 and 1957 in cities such as Savannah, Georgia, and Avon Park, Florida. Millions of infected mosquitoes were released in the streets to assess whether they could transmit yellow fever and dengue. The population was not informed of the experiment and lived normally while being exposed to the insects, which spread freely, biting adults, children, and the elderly. As a result, hundreds of people developed serious illnesses, including intense fevers, respiratory problems, encephalitis, and typhoid fever. There were also cases of stillbirths and documented deaths. To monitor the effects, military personnel disguised themselves as public health workers and photographed the sick. Although many results were recorded, the experiment left permanent victims and remains one of the most controversial episodes in military research history. Emma Eckstein, a 27-year-old woman, sought treatment from Sigmund Freud for symptoms such as stomach pains and mild depression. Diagnosed with hysteria, she underwent an experimental surgery performed by Wilhelm Fliess, Freud's colleague, who used only local anesthesia and cocaine. The procedure resulted in severe hemorrhages when gauze was left inside her nose. Despite the disaster, Freud kept Emma as his patient for 3 years. The children were observed in different stages of the disease, and doctors collected blood, feces, and tissue samples for analysis. Many suffered high fevers, jaundice, and extreme weakness, undergoing long hospitalizations. Despite criticism, the data helped distinguish hepatitis A from B, crucial information for future vaccines. The experiment, however, left deep marks and became a classic example of how scientific pursuit can exceed ethical limits. Some prisoners were forced to contract syphilis, gonorrhea, and even typhus so that their effects could be observed over time. Others had limbs frozen until they rotted, with gangrene progression carefully recorded. There were also pressure chambers where bodies exploded and incineration furnaces used to hide evidence. For Unit 731 doctors, everything was statistics: how long it took until death, which tissues necrotized first, reducing human lives to mere numbers and tables. Inside the complex, there were vivisection rooms where prisoners were dissected alive without anesthesia so that their organs could be observed functioning. Pregnant women were infected and then cut open with their fetuses in a cold quest for scientific data. Others had their blood replaced with toxic liquids to record reactions. These experiments, documented in secret reports, show how far medicine was distorted in the name of war and Japanese imperial power. Female prisoners in concentration camps were subjected to forced sterilization as part of Nazi eugenics programs. The goal was to create quick and cheap methods to prevent the reproduction of groups considered undesirable. Tests included direct radiation to the ovaries, mutilating surgeries, and chemical injections, causing permanent infertility. Many victims did not survive the cruel procedures. One of the central figures of these experiments was Nazi Dr. Karl Klauberg, who worked in Block 10 of Auschwitz. His goal was to develop a mass sterilization technique that could be applied on a large scale. Between 1941 and 1944, he injected corrosive substances into the uterus, causing inflammation and irreversible infertility. Klauberg claimed he could sterilize thousands per day, turning bodies into instruments of pseudoscience. Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death of Auschwitz, focused on twins for his macabre experiments. Without anesthesia, he performed surgeries, amputations, and injections of chemical substances on defenseless children. Many times he sewed twins together to simulate conjoined siblings or altered eye color with painful injections. His declared goal was to study genetics and increase multiple births, but in practice he left behind a trail of pain and death. When Auschwitz-Birkenau was liberated in 1945, thousands of children were found behind the fences, many still wearing striped uniforms that bore witness to their suffering. It is estimated that more than 3,000 died as direct victims of Mengele's experiments. Among the survivors were Jews and Roma, marked forever, both physically and emotionally. Many remembered the sessions where they were treated as mere laboratory objects.